It's very nice to be here today to talk about this. We've all heard about post-traumatic stress syndrome, and this session was called the Pre-Traumatic Stress Disorder of High-Impact Events, Maintaining the Public Calm and Order. So anxiety and panic about a high-impact event. Actually, we've seen this. We've seen this really recently. We've seen this in our country when Ebola became the hot issue. It was with one hospital in Dallas, didn't look like it was so prepared, and then 2 nurses got sick, and the whole country just panicked about what is going to happen about Ebola, what are we going to do. Thank goodness there was a lull, and we have 35 hospitals around the country that are really prepared. They can take care of it. They're all prepared, and we don't need to panic in the future. There is a new book that is just put out by Judith Rodin called The Resilient Dividend. She talks about resiliency, and she says that resiliency is an entity, is an individual, a community, an organization, or a natural system to prepare for disruption and recover from shocks and stress, to adapt and grow from disruptive events. As you build resiliency, therefore, you are more able to prevent and mitigate stresses and shocks. So we do prepare for certain events. We prepare for hurricanes. We have the All-American Shakeout that was started in California and now is spread out through the whole country of preparing if there's an earthquake. But there are certain things that we do not discuss. Those are the really big problems. We don't talk about nuclear. We don't talk about biological events. And we don't talk about what if we don't have electrical power for months or even a year. Often we're concerned about not talking about it because we trust our first responders. They're always going to be there. Everything will be fine. Or the government doesn't want to talk about it because we'll panic the customers and the citizens. Today we have a panel that has been doing research into this. Dr. Richard Krieg is going to talk about research here in Maryland about a nuclear attack in Washington, D.C., telling people how to save lives. Dr. Ben Shepard will discuss research that he has done with a START program at the University of Maryland and at George Washington University. Jessica Weiner, who is not able to be here, is the leader of the FEMA Nuclear Communication Working Group and has produced an excellent document. Because I'm a member of that working group, I will address her slides. And then we have Congressman Bartlett, who has described the challenges of the EMP, and he will talk about working with Congress and trying to move the EMP agenda. If we do mention these big events, will people panic? What is the result of our research? So, Rich, would you take it away?
Let me tell you why I'm here today. Back in the 1960s, when we were under the regime of mutually assured destruction, President Kennedy put Robert McNamara, head of DOD, in charge of the civil service function within the government. And every place you looked, cover of Life magazine, spots on television. In fact, Gene Hackman, the actor, his first job was as was in one of those infomercials back then. But everywhere you looked, including the sides of buildings, people talked about nuclear risk, fallout, and so on under a thermonuclear exchange. Today, you don't find that. And as I looked at this issue over time, part of my background, most of my background's in public health. I served as Commissioner of Health for the City of Chicago. And as I looked at this as a public health person, I'm not a nuclear physicist or an engineer, we have a concept called excess death in public health, and that's pretty much people who could have been saved in the situation but are not saved or experience morbidity or mortality. Most of the modeling that's been done around a nuclear blast in a large city has been done by the national lab, Sandia, principally Lawrence Livermore. And in their modeling, if you take the most benign situation of a fissionable nuclear detonation, the estimates are that about 250,000 people in the national capital region would die if they did not shelter in place. And most people do not know that their muscle memory should be to shelter where they are, particularly in commercial buildings, but also in wood frame buildings that have a basement and so on. So when you look at this issue and you look at the aspects of fallout of the deterioration of the danger in fallout, which is probably 24 hours to 48 hours under that situation, a ground level blast where the blast effects are mitigated by the buildings. You're not talking about an aerial strike like Dr. Baker did, but rather where everything in that blast zone goes up at 2 miles and the nuclear plume imposes a danger. If you take that 10 kiloton scenario, that's what the national labs have looked at in terms of the damage in Washington and the concentric rings of blast zone effects. Oh, no slides.
You're on.
Okay. One of the groups that looks at the situation, the threat level, is the Nuclear Threat Initiative that former Senator Sam Nunn, who headed up the committee on the Armed Services Committee, as well as Henry Kissinger, former Commerce Secretary George Shultz. The three of them set up NTI, which is based in Washington, D.C., with Senator Nunn as the head. And they monitor the theft of fissionable materials around the world. They are very attentive to the statements of terrorist groups. They look at the threat levels imposed by the storage of nuclear facilities. And when you go up and speak to them, they are very concerned about the situation, both state actors, where the threat level undoubtedly is going up, the instability in Pakistan, the relation now with Russia, where most of this is, most of the fissionable material is stored, as well as Iran, obviously, and North Korea, that it is possible to imagine that these countries would think of this as a strategy. They have thought of this as a strategy. And then when you look at the non-state actors, most of the terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda, have been very specific in their interest in building a bomb or securing a bomb to strike Washington, New York, Chicago, very specifically. So what we've done is we've been working in Howard County, Maryland, and with the Maryland Mercy Management Association. We've had a succession of projects that were designed to alert the local community to this issue. The southern tip of Howard County is midway between Washington and Baltimore. The southern flank of the county is 25 miles from the White House. As we've worked there, our specific intent was to develop strategies to get the community aware of this issue and to have them have that muscle memory where they know that they have to quickly get into shelter. How we've approached this has been a series of projects. FEMA has been helping us on several of them. We've worked with MEMA. Back in 2013, we had Brooke Budemeyer, who is the lead person at Lawrence Livermore on this issue. And Brooke goes around to the major cities of the United States and meets with the first responders on this issue. It's done on a low-key basis. It's not done on a public basis, but he's made a number of circuits around the country. We had him come in and speak to about 200 community leaders in Howard County about the threat, about how to respond to this sort of a situation. Back in March 5th of 2013, myself and my colleague Dan Hanfling, who's head of emergency services at Inova Medical System in Virginia, we convened about 300 health and hospital leaders in Howard County at the Applied Physics Laboratory to talk about this scenario. And it was the first time that health people had sat down to look at the implications of a nuclear blast in the nation's capital. And we came up with recommendations. And one of the chief recommendations is that because the assumption is that the word about sheltering in place will not come down from the federal level, we have to have a highly strategic approach to work with communities so that that message is getting across. And the best intervention we've had really is to go in and, for example, have 100 people representing that community. First responders, nonprofit leaders, health people, educators in the public school system. We present them with a very realistic scenario, a video that we produce that shows this blast happening in Washington. It's highly high quality, it's emotional, it's gripping, it's accurate scientifically. And then we give them a pretty quick overview of the science in terms of that detonation. What can you expect in the aftermath of that? And then we talk about policy planning, practice, programs, and how this event should affect that. So we've had a number of findings that I think are useful. First, it's important to recognize that there's a very high interest in this topic. When people grasp that they're that close to the capital or to a large urban center, they really get it. They're not unduly concerned. We don't see evidence, at least panic in talking about it, but they get very engaged. We had one meeting in Howard County where it was scheduled to be an hour and a half. It went to 3 hours. And we had PTA people sitting down with first responders and talking about what would happen. There's relief that if this scenario were to occur, a ground blast, and the thinking is that perhaps this would be comparable to the box cutter in 9/11, where it would be a terrorist organization that had a bomb, but they take it in a pickup truck or a panel truck or a van, and they would detonate it. We use that assumption knowing that this is a target-rich environment. You only have to drive past NSA to see that that road is just a few blocks from some of the main buildings. You can't drive in because they have barriers there, but it'd be very easy to imagine this happening. We have Fort Meade, Cyber Command, and all of the defense industries. Mary's organization, Applied Physics Lab, has about 5,000 defense and space researchers there. So we're in a target-rich environment, and we realized that this could happen any place. But our assumption was that Washington, D.C. would be first on the list. What we found with first responders is that they are very interested in this topic. There is a concern that by focusing on this nuclear attack scenario, that it would offset the all hazards planning that they stand for. The hierarchical NIMS planning that would be invoked in any type of emergency situation. They see this as kind of a sexy topic that captures people's attention, but in fact it's obviously a low impact, a high impact, very low probability event, although I think the risk is increasing. And what we have found in these meetings that we have is that if you kind of bring it home by saying, you know, if you're in a hurricane alley, you do all hazards planning, but you emphasize hurricanes. If you're in an earthquake zone, you do all hazards planning, but you look at what happens in an earthquake. If you're near Washington, D.C. or a large city, you need to think about this as a possible incident that would happen. And that argument really prevails. I think they understand that. And many of these first responders have become kind of, in Chuck's words, patriots in terms of wanting to be involved in this issue and lending their support. With citizens, we found that there is a very strong interest in the topic. We've gone into the public school system. We've presented this sort of the information to, for example, 76 assistant principals, the people who have to stand up the individual school emergency response plans. They got it, and they are making changes in the plan. The most difficult issue that exists here, and I was down in Georgia to see CDC doing this, a tabletop with the Atlanta public school system, and you could really see this, is that parents want to go to the school, retrieve their child after this blast, and then go home. And the safest place is in the school. The safest place by far, even if there's not a basement, if you're in a gymnasium and there's space up to that roof, that protects you because there's fallout there. The fallout are like grains of sand. Again, if it was that situation, the fallout effects would dissipate very rapidly within 24 or 48 hours. So the students would have to stay there. And in our work with the schools and the reports that we produce, we talk about how to deal with parents, how to have students stay there for 24 hours, what are all the implications of that, how does that mesh with strategic plan of the Department of Education in Maryland and with the Howard County Public School System. Again, there's no evidence of anxiety. My strong impression is that people working on this issue, the public people, are very glad to get these facts. They like having the information. And it's their belief that the public can handle this, that we can talk about this, we should talk about this. Over 98% of the participants in these meetings and the evaluations that occurred see this as a very important or an important issue across all of the different projects that we've done. Over 95% of the participants say it's essential to inform the public about the need to shelter in place following a nuclear attack. And that, I think the most common response we get is if so many people could die in this situation and so many people could be saved if they realized they had a shelter and not do exactly the opposite thing, which is to get in their car and endanger themselves, why is it that the government isn't doing more in this area? That's what the public says. They just don't understand that. And that goes back to our March 5th findings where the same issue came up, and we just made the strategic decision that we wanted to work at the local level. And as we've interacted with the Maryland Emergency Management Agency, that's really been the thrust of what we're thinking about, is to get in, do a rapid intervention. Every community has similar types of information mechanisms, but they also are singular in terms of who are the people that get involved. And what we've gone to, as my final remark, is to go in to a community, give them our drill as far as the video and the science, and then ask them with low cost or no cost basis, okay, 30 community leaders, how is it that you get this word out in your community? How would you use the library system? Who are the connectors in the community? How, on a fairly rapid basis, could you get out this message of sheltering in place in a nuclear detonation situation? And we've been very encouraged by the results of that in terms of what the output has been of these kind of crude strategic information campaigns. So with that, I'll stop.
Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the electricity. When we're kind of looking at EMP events, it's important to look at the societal reactions to better prepare and respond and recover from events. And one of the key features we need to really kind of get to grips with is that the public is not prone to panic. And we've seen that time and time again because of various natural and man-made disasters. In fact, rather than panic, people who experience sudden crisis respond actively and consistently as possible, according to the pre-disaster roles. And a lot of social science research can actually back that particular point up. However, what we do see is that people may actually change and modify their behaviours, which may actually undermine the safety and well-being of themselves and those around them. It's not that they're panicking, but that they're sort of changing their behaviours, which may actually undermine the whole sort of management and response process. For example, food hoarding or looking to trying to get much fuel as possible. Actions which may actually undermine and have unintended cascading effects for the wider response. So looking at the cellular EMP, an interesting feature to this is that we may well have a warning of 18 to 96 hours, give or take a little bit, which raises the question, what do we actually inform the public and tell the public to do during that time? Particularly as, well, we heard from one of the speakers yesterday, that you may only actually get a 10% probability of accuracy of the warning, say, yep, there will be a major geomagnetic storm. And even a warning of a medium-level geomagnetic storm may actually result into a very severe level storm. So we've got some ambiguity, uncertainty around that. And so we have the challenge of, well, does the responsibility to inform the public conflict with not causing social disturbance? However, we can actually look at the earthquake arena where they're actually pulling on to say, what are the challenges for predictive earthquake warning? As the science becomes a little bit more accurate, and over the years we'll have more maybe predictability in that area to some degree, how should you then tailor and customize warning systems accordingly? So we can keep a close eye on what they're doing to then help inform what we can then try and do in the solar EMP environment. For both solar and the cyber arena, we're unlikely to see looting by the public. Now this is, you often hear about this in various different quarters, but from looking at the various responses from the public to various disasters, we don't tend to see that occurring. Indeed, if you look at, say, the August 2003 blackout in New York, there wasn't really any major looting there, and the blackout extended from Ohio, Toronto to Ottawa, lasted about 14 to 24 hours. Okay, a lot shorter period than a major solar EMP would be. But what we saw was kind of spontaneous humanity, people sharing water, assisting others over the barriers, and even people spontaneously taking on traffic control responsibilities. So there was concern, resolve, and excitement. So there's kind of a good, fairly decent baseline to work with the public, particularly during the earlier part following a disaster, to actually keep them on board and inform them what actions they might take to help better get the society through the event itself. However, where we may see pre-existing social tensions, that may actually then lead to or contribute to civil disturbance. And we saw that actually in the 1977 blackout in New York, where there was arson, looting, but it was mainly in the low-income areas, and it was thought that actually the rapid and significant economic decline in those areas meant that the looting and the violence was a response to the economic suffering and hopelessness that was seen in those particular communities. But Mayor Bloomberg in 2003 said, actually, well, New York of 2003 is a very different place to New York in 77. And I think that actually had a significant impact on how the city responded to the blackout in 2003 versus 77. And there's other areas of research that may suggest that if you've got underlying social tensions, you put on top of that a major event, a disaster, then those social tensions could then start to come up, bubble up to the fore. So what we may see from a major event is that individuals, families, and neighbours will work in small groups, largely unsupervised, to respond to the disaster and use whatever tools available to them, including the acquisition of resources from local businesses to achieve their goals. Not necessarily purchasing them, but they may go in and say, well, we need these essential equipment, there's nobody there, that will help us to get more resiliency in our community. That sometimes can be mistakenly seen as looting, whereas actually, well, here are some individuals who are actually trying to make the way to say, how can we prudently ensure more resiliency within our society, given the considerable degradation there. And so that's another kind of feature, say, well, what is really kind of looting for the purpose of looting for self-serving, to that, well, more for general survival. Obviously, someone trying to take off a big flat screen TVs following a blackout is clearly not doing it for more to survival purposes. But if we're looking at, say, hardware stores and shops and things, then that can be seen otherwise. But it's best that's done in a structured way in which there are some authorities to be able to better help and facilitate the process where possible, given that, say, electronic transactions may not be possible at that particular time. But public responses to earthquakes show that we have this self-reported behaviour of persons who experience the earthquakes, on the whole, controlled, rational, and adaptive and varied. And particularly say look at the Loma Prieta earthquake in '89 or Northridge in '94, and there's a host of others as well in that. And also with a major solar event, a key feature that we need to keep in mind, and with a cyber attack as well, is that there will not be the direct physical damage and casualties that I would say experience from a kinetic attack, say an I&D event. So we have that kind of upside to this. So when we kind of look at what we should do to these areas, it's probably worth asking the question, what are the upsides of this scenario we're dealing with? What is still working? What can we do? What is the most effective way we can better exploit these functions that are still operating, rather than just focusing on what's not working, what's not getting in there, because that way, if we turn it the other way around, we probably then be able to find some more innovative solutions to the various different scenarios we're working with. Now, communications is going to be essential before, during, and after the events. Now, we've heard a lot about, okay, the public's not prone to panic and actually kind of, very receptive to information on what they might need to do to try and prepare for events. What should an event actually take place? Some of the essential attributes could include communicating a basic survival guide to even say cell phones or computers while the system is still there but maybe gradually degrading. For a major solar EMP event, not all power go out at once. It was probably likely to be a gradual degradation as the electricity, well, the high voltage transformers gradually go out of action. So there's going to be that window of opportunity to pump out this information of what can you do as a society and individuals for the next even couple of months for the basic survival, say collecting rainwater, storing and cooking meat and some advice on that and dealing with sewage and trash and likewise. And also to make it clear that this is probably a nationwide event, not a local event. And so this would prevent, say, individuals getting in their cars and looking to keep driving until they find the lights are on. There's a good point made by a group yesterday. And that would then reduce the potential of individuals and families clogging up the roads needlessly, running out of petrol and being stranded in the middle of West Virginia or wherever. Other kind of communication aspects is that to convey this may last for several months. And all these features will then actually provide some degree of hope and sense that someone is out there to try and respond and deal with this particular situation. And then the sense of hope is really going to be important to get the communities through such a situation. For a nuclear event, just a couple of brief words on this. Okay, it's naturally to be a no-notice event, but we're also going to see maybe increased dread from the survivors, those not in the immediate impact area. Those who are in the more immediate impact area, the concerns are more likely to be physical safety, essential food and water shelter, while the EMP is probably more likely to be third to that. But common to both of them, just quickly finishing on this, is that we need to look at it as what's best for society, not for individuals, and look at how we can repurpose existing assets to better prepare and respond to these various events.
Thank you very much. I've been asked to comment briefly on my experiences on the Hill. With my legislation, of course, that set in place the EMP Commission, I wanted to set up that commission, and the committee didn't want to do it. Probably 2/3 of the members of the Armed Services Committee had never heard of EMP, and they thought it was frivolous, and they didn't want to set it up. The principal staff didn't want to set it up. There was one person on the staff that was supporting me, and we wrote up legislation to set up the committee, and I was told you can't do that because it might require sequential referral. That means that other committees would have to look at it, and that would slow down the bill, and we wouldn't get it out, and we had to get the bill out, so you can't do it. I said, what other committees would be involved? And so they told me, and I went to the chairman of those committees, and I got a letter waiving jurisdiction. So I took those letters back to the staff and the chair of the committee, then they had no defense, and so we got the EMP Commission set up. When I talked to my colleagues about this, there were two different responses. One was that this just isn't going to happen. If something is too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. And this seemed too bad to be true. You mean electricity without it, no electricity for a year? Maybe 90% of our population died. Oh, nonsense. This can't happen. And so they just walked away from it. Others bought the threat. Gee, we really need to do something about that, don't we? But then the tyranny of the urgent took over. The urgent always takes precedence over the important. The thing you got to do today, you do today, and the other one you'll do tomorrow. But the sun comes up tomorrow, and what do you know? It's today. So tomorrow never comes. And that's what happened on the Hill. How many of you have read the book No Blade of Grass? Anybody read the book? Okay. The Library of Congress has it. I know because one of my staff went and got the book and read it. It's a story, and it's relevant here. It's a story of our world when the virus attacks all grass-related plants, and they all die. If you think about that, that's rice, that's corn, that's barley, it's all of the grains that we eat. It was in Europe, but it hadn't come to America yet, and England was making do with shipments of wheat from Canada. And then they got a notice from Canada, gee, the virus has shown up here, and I'm sorry, we have to keep our wheat supply here because we'll need it here, so no more wheat for England. So what England decided to do about this was to have an air raid drill and bottle up their people in their cities. And then they were going to drop a nuclear weapon on each of those cities because that was the kindest thing to do. There was no way going to be enough food to keep everybody alive, and rather than having the people slowly starve to death, they would solve the problem this way. Let's hope we don't come to that kind of a solution relative to EMP. How many of you here are more than 88 years old? Gosh, I'm the oldest person here. I remember very well the Cold War, and everybody was involved in that war. Everywhere you went, every public building, there were brochures there to pick up what you should be doing to prepare for that event. We had drills in schools. I worked at NIH. We had a drill there. The clinical center was going to be a big 500-bed hospital. And then the thermonuclear weapon was developed, and we might be a part of the fireball. So we stopped having drills when that happened. But, you know, I think that people felt better about that because they were doing something. And they had the feeling that, gee, maybe I can make it through this because I'm storing some food. I'm storing some water. I have a fallout shelter. I worked for IBM. They were loaning their people money interest-free to build a backyard shelter there. Everybody was involved. People were doing something about that. I think one of the things we can do to avoid this pre-traumatic stress is to have people involved. It's not hopeless. I'm doing something. Gee, maybe I'll make it through that if I do well at this. So I think that we need to get people involved. I rode down here this morning thinking about this, and I looked out there and I saw all of those big, tall buildings with apartments in them. What in the heck are they going to do to prepare for a year without electricity? I'm going to be interested in what solutions others have to this problem. Then I thought about, what is it, 50 million people on food stamps? How in the heck can they prepare? Everybody ought to have a year's supply of food. That's not hard. I was in Sam's Club the other day, and there was 50 pounds of rice there, and it went up. I think it was $17 now. A couple of years ago, it was $16.44. 50 pounds of rice. That's a heck of a lot of rice, isn't it? There are other things similarly cheap that you could buy. It's pretty darn easy to put by a year's supply of food. But how are those 50 million people on food stamps going to do that? We face a huge problem here. By the way, one of the things that makes me feel really good is that you're here. Because when I started talking about this, the first person I called was Tom Clancy when I learned about this. Tom was a good supporter. He did fundraisers for me, and he had an EMP scenario in one of his books, so I knew he'd done good research. And said, gee, if you read my book, you know all I know, but let me refer you to the smartest man hired by the U.S. government. Gee, that's a tall order. The government hires a lot of people. To his view, that was a Dr. Lowell Wood from Lawrence Livermore. This was pre-cell phone. Remember the old pagers? Up to the satellite and back? And I paged Lowell Wood. I thought he was in Lawrence Livermore in California. He happened to be in Washington. Within an hour, he's sitting in my office. This is a huge, huge problem. It just defies imagination that we're not really doing something meaningful about the problem. We're just barely nibbling at the edges of this problem. The next panel, I think, will further explore this. But I'm really pleased that you're here, because now it's not just Roscoe Bartlett up there. I went to the floor probably half a dozen times and spoke for an hour on EMP with a lot of charts and so forth. Now, Roscoe Bartlett now is represented by hundreds and thousands of people who know something about this, and my hope that we will do something meaningful about it is increased every time I come to one of these events. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, panel. That was very interesting. I think that we have time for one question. All right.
10 years ago, Hopkins National Labs put together how to prepare and react to a nuclear event. And it's free on the internet, and though some of it is outdated, the majority of it is very, very applicable to what we were speaking about now. It is a very lengthy document, but much of it is applicable and will be very helpful to the populace today. Have any of you ever, you know about it, you've read it, studied it? And my perspective is something like that will need to be from outside presented to the public.
Let me try to answer that, because Jessica Whiter, who is not here because she's ill, leads the FEMA working group on communication. And that working group has produced a document that really goes into the current thinking about how to prepare for a nuclear attack, and also how to prepare for a situation that would happen at a nuclear power plant. And so those two documents are out on the web. So if you query nuclear and go into FEMA, you should be able to pick up those two documents. And those documents are really, they're going around and talking to first responders so that there would be consistent messaging that would come out as that. Sheltering in place, and get inside, and stay informed is the kind of current guidelines of what you ought to be doing. So, thank you.